The small, weathered envelope sat nestled between electric bills and grocery store flyers in the mailbox of the old farmhouse. It was April 2019, and 76-year-old Elizabeth wiped her gardening hands on her apron before reaching in to collect the day's mail. She flipped through the stack with practiced indifference until her fingers touched the yellowed paper. Something about it made her pause. The return address was faded, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Elizabeth's heart seemed to stop for a moment, then race forward as if making up for lost time. She knew that handwriting as well as her own. It belonged to her father, Robert, who had died in the Vietnam War over 5 decades ago. This can't be, she whispered to herself, standing frozen in the driveway. The postmark showed a date from 1969. 50 years. For 50 years, this letter had been searching for its way home. Elizabeth's hands trembled as she carried the envelope inside. The farmhouse had been in her family for generations. She'd grown up here, watching her mother wait by the window for her father to return from war. He never did. And now, decades after her mother had passed away too, here was his voice reaching through time. She sat at the kitchen table, the same one where she'd eaten breakfast as a child while her father teased her about her pigtails. The letter felt impossibly light in her hands, as if the words inside might float away if she opened it too quickly. "Mom? You okay?" Her son Thomas appeared in the doorway, still in his work clothes from the auto shop he owned in town. At 52, Thomas had his grandfather's height and strong jaw. It was like seeing a ghost sometimes, Elizabeth thought. "I got a letter," she said, her voice barely audible. "From Dad." Thomas's eyebrows shot up. "What? How is that possible?" Elizabeth shook her head. "The postmark says 1969. Right before he..." She couldn't finish the sentence, even after all these years. Thomas pulled up a chair and sat beside her. "Do you want me to call Jenny?" he asked, referring to Elizabeth's younger sister who lived 2 towns over. "Not yet," Elizabeth replied. "Let me read it first." Thomas nodded, understanding. He squeezed his mother's shoulder gently and then moved to put on a pot of coffee, giving her space while staying close enough if she needed him. Elizabeth carefully opened the envelope, trying not to tear the brittle paper. Inside was a single sheet, covered front and back with her father's familiar sloping script. She took a deep breath and began to read. "My dearest family, **. Tonight the jungle is alive with sounds, but somehow it feels quieter than usual. Maybe it's just me finding a moment of peace before tomorrow's mission. The boys are playing cards, but I wanted to write to you instead. Some feeling tells me I should put these words down now, **. Lizzie, my darling girl, you'll be turning 7 next month. I've missed so many of your birthdays already. I think about your bright eyes and your questions about everything under the sun. Keep asking those questions, sweetheart. The world needs curious minds like yours. I've saved a special gift for you that I hope to give you myself when I return. Jenny, my little firecracker, barely 3 and already so stubborn. Your mother writes that you insist on wearing your rain boots even on sunny days. That made me laugh out here in the jungle. Stay stubborn, baby girl. It will serve you well in life. And Mary, my beloved wife, the center of our little universe. You carry so much on your shoulders while I'm away. I see your strength in every letter you send, in every word you choose so carefully not to worry me. I worry anyway, of course. But I also know that if anyone can hold our family together through this separation, it's you." Elizabeth paused, wiping tears from her cheeks. Her mother had indeed held them together, working as a nurse and raising 2 girls alone after the telegram arrived announcing her father's death in action. She'd never remarried, saying she'd already had her great love story. The letter continued with details about her father's daily life, jokes from his fellow soldiers, a monkey they'd befriended at camp, plans for fixing the barn roof when he returned. All ordinary things made extraordinary by the 5 decades it took for them to be read. Near the end, his words turned more serious. Tomorrow we move into an area that's seen heavy fighting. The captain says it should be routine, but I've been in this country long enough to know there's no such thing as routine. If you're reading this, it means I made it back to write you a better letter in person. But just in case, I want you all to know that every minute away from you has been worth it to keep you safe, to give you the future you deserve. I carry your faces with me everywhere. When things get dark, and they do get dark sometimes, I just close my eyes and I can see Mary laughing in the kitchen, Lizzie reading on the porch swing, Jenny chasing butterflies in the yard. That's home. That's what I'm fighting for. All my love, now and always. Robert. Elizabeth clutched the letter to her chest, feeling the weight of every word. Her father had written this the night before he died. His last thoughts had been of them. Mom? Thomas's voice was gentle. He placed a steaming mug of coffee on the table beside her. He knew, Elizabeth said softly. Somehow he knew he wouldn't be coming home. Thomas sat beside her again. What happened to the letter? Why did it take so long? Elizabeth shook her head. I don't know. Maybe it got lost in a mail facility somewhere. Maybe it was misrouted. 50 years. She looked out the window at the barn her father had planned to fix. Her late husband had repaired it instead, following the farm's transition through the decades. We should call Aunt Jenny, Thomas said. And maybe the post office might have some answers? Elizabeth nodded slowly, her mind still in 1969. Yes, we'll call Jenny. But first, I need to show you something. She stood up and walked to the old roll-top desk in the corner of the living room. From a small drawer, she removed a velvet pouch that had remained untouched for years. She returned to the table and carefully emptied the contents into her palm. Dad mentioned a gift he'd saved for my birthday, she explained, showing Thomas a delicate silver locket. Mom gave this to me on my 7th birthday. She said Dad had picked it out before he left, asked her to keep it until my birthday if he couldn't be there himself. Thomas examined the locket with gentle fingers. It's beautiful. I never knew he'd written to us about it, Elizabeth said, fresh tears forming. All these years, I thought of it as the gift he left behind. But now I know he was thinking about it that very last night. The afternoon light streamed through the kitchen windows as mother and son sat together, connecting pieces of their family history that had been separated by time. Outside, the farm continued its spring awakening, just as it had for generations. Inside, a voice from the past had finally completed its journey home. And this was just the beginning of the story. The letter would lead Elizabeth and her family down a path of discovery they never could have imagined, about her father, about the war, and about connections that neither time nor distance could sever. Elizabeth's sister Jenny arrived at the farmhouse the following morning, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a hasty ponytail and her eyes wide with disbelief. She'd driven straight over after Thomas called her, not even stopping to change out of her gardening clothes. "Where is it?" she asked breathlessly as Elizabeth opened the door. The two sisters embraced, and Elizabeth could feel Jenny trembling slightly. "Come sit down," Elizabeth said, leading her to the kitchen where the letter waited, now carefully placed in a clear plastic sleeve Thomas had found to protect the fragile paper. Jenny's hands shook as she reached for it. At 73, she was still the little firecracker their father had described, her energy barely dimmed by age. But now, faced with words from a father she barely remembered, she seemed suddenly vulnerable. "I was only 3 when he died," she whispered. "I don't even have real memories of him, just photographs and stories you and Mom told me." Elizabeth nodded. "I know. That's why this feels like such a miracle. It's like he's speaking directly to us." Jenny read slowly, her fingers tracing each line as if trying to absorb the ink into her skin. When she reached the part about her rain boots, She let out a soft laugh that dissolved into tears. "Mom used to tell me that story," she said. "I thought maybe she made it up to give me something to hold on to about him. But he really did know me, didn't he? Even from so far away." Elizabeth put her arm around her sister's shoulders. "He knew us all." After reading the letter twice more, Jenny finally looked up. "But how did this happen? Where has the letter been all this time? And why now?" Thomas, who had been making calls from the living room, stepped into the kitchen. "I've been speaking with the postmaster in town. He's fascinated by this and wants to help track down what happened. He's going to call some connections at the regional processing center." "I'm not sure it matters," Jenny said, still staring at the letter. "It's here now. That's what counts." "It matters to me," Elizabeth said firmly. "Dad wrote this the night before he died. It's been lost for 50 years while we built our lives without him. I want to know where it's been all this time." Thomas's phone rang, and he stepped back into the living room to answer it. Elizabeth took the opportunity to make tea, a ritual that had always calmed her. As she placed the kettle on the stove, she noticed Jenny studying the envelope intently. "What is it?" she asked. Jenny held up the envelope. "There's something written on the back. It's faint, but look." Elizabeth leaned closer. In pencil, nearly erased by time and handling, were the words, "Held by Lieutenant James Wilson, 3rd Battalion." "Lieutenant Wilson," Elizabeth breathed. Dad mentioned him in his letters to Mom. They were friends. Thomas returned to the kitchen, excitement visible on his face. "That was Bill from the VFW. I asked if he knew anything about tracking down military mail service records. He says he doesn't, but he knows something better. There's a veterans reunion happening next month in Chicago for Dad's unit. Some of the guys who served with him might still be there." Jenny and Elizabeth exchanged glances. "After all these years?" Jenny asked. "It's the 50th anniversary of their deployment," Thomas explained. "Bill says these reunions happen every 5 years, but this is a big one." Elizabeth felt a flutter of something she hadn't experienced in years, hope mixed with anxiety. "Do you think someone there might know what happened to Dad's letter?" "Only one way to find out," Thomas said. 3 weeks later, Elizabeth found herself in the passenger seat of Thomas's car, with Jenny in the back, driving toward Chicago. They had the letter securely packed in Thomas's carry-on, along with a small album of family photos spanning the 5 decades since their father's death. What if no one remembers him? Jenny voiced the fear that had been growing as they approached the city. Dad was memorable, Elizabeth reassured her. And they were in combat together. Those bonds don't just disappear. The hotel hosting the reunion was filled with elderly men in caps identifying their military service, some in wheelchairs, others moving slowly with canes or walkers. A few were accompanied by wives or children, but many had come alone, drawn by the invisible thread that connected them to a time when they were young men in a foreign jungle. At the registration table, a volunteer handed them visitor badges after Thomas explained their connection. The woman's expression softened when he mentioned Robert's name. "The reunion dinner is tonight," she told them. "But most of the men are already gathered in the main hall sharing stories. You're welcome to go in." They entered a large room filled with round tables where small groups of veterans were clustered together. Black and white photographs lined the walls, showing young men with serious expressions standing in jungle landscapes or beside military vehicles. Elizabeth felt suddenly overwhelmed. These men had been the last people to see her father alive. Some of them might have spoken to him the morning he died, might have heard his final words. "How will we ever find someone who knew Dad?" Jenny whispered. As if in answer, an announcement came over the PA system. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be starting our unit roll call in 5 minutes. Please take your seats according to your company assignments." Thomas guided his mother and aunt to one side of the room. "We can watch the roll call. If anyone from Dad's company is here, we'll know. The ceremony began with a moment of silence for those who never returned. Elizabeth closed her eyes, picturing her father as he appeared in the last photo they had of him, standing tall in his uniform before deployment, his arm around her mother's waist, his smile confident and reassuring. When the roll call reached her father's company, Elizabeth held her breath. One by one, names were called, and elderly men stood to applause from their comrades. Lieutenant James Wilson. A man at a nearby table slowly rose to his feet, leaning heavily on a cane. He was tall and thin, his white hair cropped short in what Elizabeth imagined was still a military-influenced style. "Lieutenant Wilson," she whispered, clutching Jenny's hand. The name on the envelope. After the roll call concluded, people began moving around the room again, reconnecting with old friends. Elizabeth couldn't take her eyes off Lieutenant Wilson, who was now engaged in conversation with another veteran. "Should we approach him?" Jenny asked nervously. Thomas nodded. "That's why we came." They made their way across the room, Elizabeth's heart pounding in her chest. When they reached his table, Lieutenant Wilson looked up with polite curiosity. "Excuse me," Elizabeth began, her voice steadier than she felt. "My name is Elizabeth Matthews. My father was Robert Johnson. I believe you might have known him." The change in Wilson's expression was immediate and profound. The polite mask fell away, replaced by shock and then something deeper, recognition tinged with old sorrow. "Little Lizzie," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "My God." He reached out a trembling hand, which Elizabeth took in both of hers. "You look so much like him," Wilson continued, his eyes moving between Elizabeth and Jenny. "Both of you do. He carried your pictures everywhere." "We have something to show you," Elizabeth said. "Something that might help explain why we're here after all this time." She nodded to Thomas, who carefully removed the protected letter from his bag and placed it on the table in front of Lieutenant Wilson. The old soldier stared at it for a long moment before recognition dawned in his eyes. "I never thought I'd see this again," he whispered, reaching for the letter with reverence. "After all these years." And Elizabeth knew they had found the beginning of their answers. Lieutenant Wilson's weathered hands trembled as he touched the letter. The din of the reunion hall seemed to fade away, leaving just the four of them in a bubble of shared history. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the plastic sleeve protecting the letter. Elizabeth nodded, and Thomas carefully removed the letter, handing it to the elderly veteran. Wilson put on reading glasses that hung from a cord around his neck and studied the pages with intense concentration. "Your father wrote this the night before Hollow Valley," he said finally, his voice low and reverent. "We all called it that, the valley where everything went hollow. The official name was Operation Clearwater, but none of us used that name." Elizabeth felt a chill. In all the official documentation about her father's death, she'd never heard this term. "Hollow Valley?" Wilson nodded. "We were sent to clear a suspected enemy encampment. Intelligence said it was a small outpost, lightly defended." His eyes took on a faraway look. Intelligence was wrong. Jenny reached out and touched his arm gently. "Our father died there." "Yes, he did." Wilson looked down at the letter again. "Along with 22 other men. It was an ambush. I was wounded, took shrapnel in my leg and back." "Your father." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "Your father was the reason any of us made it out alive." Elizabeth and Jenny exchanged glances. Their mother had received only the basic information, that Robert had been killed in action while serving his country honorably. "What happened?" Thomas asked. Wilson gestured to a quieter corner of the hall. "Let's sit down." They moved to an empty table away from the main crowd. Wilson walked with difficulty, his cane tapping a rhythm on the carpeted floor. Once seated, he continued. "The night before, we all knew something was off. The jungle was too quiet. Your father felt it too, that's why he wrote this letter. Wilson tapped the pages with his finger. He asked me to make sure it got mailed if anything happened to him. Said he had a feeling about the mission. Elizabeth nodded, remembering her father's words. Some feeling tells me I should put these words down now. The next morning, we moved into the valley at dawn. Everything looked clear until we reached the center. Then all hell broke loose. We were surrounded, taking fire from 3 sides. Wilson paused, taking a deep breath. Your father was our radio operator. When the captain went down, communications became critical. We needed air support, but our position was blocked by dense jungle canopy. Wilson stopped, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Robert ran to higher ground to get a signal out. Completely exposed. He knew what he was doing. He got that call through, gave our coordinates, and stayed on the line directing the choppers in while taking fire. Elizabeth closed her eyes, imagining her father in that moment, determined, focused, thinking of his family back home while doing what needed to be done. By the time the dust settled, most of the company was either dead or wounded. I was hit pretty bad. The medevac choppers came in, started loading us up. Wilson rubbed his leg absently. Your father's body was recovered by the second team that came in. I had his letter in my breast pocket when they loaded me on the chopper. But why didn't the letter reach us? Jenny asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Wilson sighed heavily. That's where it gets complicated. I was sent to a field hospital, then transferred to Japan, then stateside. Spent 8 months in various hospitals. The letter stayed with me, I kept it safe, waiting until I was well enough to make sure it got to you properly. He looked at Elizabeth apologetically. By the time I was discharged, I tried to send it through official channels. But there had been a change of address filed for your mother. The forwarding period had expired. The letter came back to me marked undeliverable. Elizabeth nodded slowly. After their father's death, their mother had moved them closer to her parents for support. She'd tried to make a fresh start. I tried to find your family several times over the years, Wilson continued. This was before the internet, before cell phones. I hired a private investigator once in the late 70s, but he couldn't locate your mother. Eventually, I put the letter in my footlocker with my service mementos. So how did it finally reach us? Thomas asked. Wilson shook his head in bewilderment. That's what I can't understand. I keep that footlocker in my attic. Last year, my daughter helped me go through it when I moved to a smaller place. We found the letter, and I told her the story. She's the only other person who knew about it. Elizabeth felt a strange tingling at the base of her neck. Where does your daughter live? Colorado. Denver. Wilson's brow furrowed. She visited me in February. Said she was going to try one more time to find your family, said these days with the internet, it should be possible. He looked at them in confusion. But she never told me she'd found you or sent the letter. Thomas pulled out his phone. What's your daughter's name? Maybe we should call her. Patricia Wilson Collins, he replied. But something doesn't add up. The postmark on that envelope is from 1969, not 2019. And I had the letter with me all these years. Elizabeth examined the envelope again. The 1969 postmark was clear, yet faded with age. How could a letter that never entered the mail system have a genuine postmark? This doesn't make sense, Jenny said, echoing everyone's thoughts. Wilson reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. Let me call Patricia right now. She might be able to clear this up. While Wilson made the call, Elizabeth studied the old soldier's face. The years had etched deep lines around his eyes and mouth, but she could still see traces of the young lieutenant her father had trusted with his final words to his family. Wilson's conversation was brief. When he hung up, his expression was puzzled. Patricia says she never sent the letter. She helped me pack it in a special archival box for safekeeping. It should still be in my apartment. A heavy silence fell over the table as they all contemplated the impossible situation before them. Does Patricia know anyone at your old address? Thomas suggested. Maybe someone found a copy of the letter? Wilson shook his head. There was only one letter, and I've had it for 50 years. He hesitated. At least, I thought I did. Jenny reached for her sister's hand. Maybe we should check your apartment, make sure the letter is still there? If it is. Then we have 2 identical letters from Dad, Elizabeth finished, which raises even more questions. Wilson nodded slowly. My apartment isn't far from here. Patricia gave me a ride to the reunion, but we could take a taxi. Elizabeth looked at her son and sister, seeing her own curiosity and unease reflected in their expressions. I think we need to see this through, she said. As they prepared to leave the reunion hall, an elderly man approached their table. He wore thick glasses and walked with a pronounced limp. Jim, the man said, addressing Wilson. I thought that was you. It's been years. He glanced at Elizabeth, Jenny, and Thomas curiously. Frank, Wilson said, standing to shake the man's hand. Good to see you. These are Robert Johnson's daughters and grandson. Frank's eyes widened. Johnson's family? After all this time? He looked at Elizabeth and Jenny with newfound interest. Your father saved a lot of lives that day, including mine. We were just discussing something strange, Wilson said. Do you remember the letter Johnson wrote the night before the valley? Frank nodded slowly, his expression turning grave. The letter you carried all those years? Of course I remember. He turned to Elizabeth. Did he finally find you? The letter reached us last month, Elizabeth explained. But Lieutenant Wilson says he still has it in his apartment. Frank's face paled. That's not possible. He looked at Wilson. Unless what? Wilson prompted. Frank lowered his voice. Unless it's true what they said about Johnson. That he knew things before they happened. That he had some kind of sixth sense. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken questions and the dawning sense that this mystery went far deeper than any of them had imagined. Elizabeth stared at Frank, trying to process his words. What do you mean, my father had a sixth sense? Frank glanced at Wilson, who gave a slight nod, as if granting permission to continue. Your father had a way about him, Frank explained, settling into a chair. His arthritic hands rested on the table, fingers gently drumming. He knew things. Small things at first, who would get mail on a particular day, when it would rain despite clear skies. The guys started to notice. Wilson nodded. We didn't talk about it much. In a war zone, you take any advantage you can get. If Johnson had hunches, we listened. The night before Hollow Valley, Frank continued, your father was different. Quieter. He told 3 of us to switch positions during our advance the next day. All 3 of those original positions took direct hits within minutes of the ambush. Elizabeth felt a chill run through her. Her mother had occasionally mentioned that Robert had good intuition, but nothing to this extent. I was one of those 3, Frank said softly. That's why I'm sitting here today. Jenny leaned forward. Are you suggesting our father somehow knew he was going to die? That he had some kind of premonition? And that somehow his letter exists in 2 places at once? Thomas added, skepticism evident in his voice. Frank shrugged. I'm just telling you what we experienced. Your father saved lives with his hunches. As for the letter. He looked at Wilson. That's beyond my understanding. Wilson checked his watch. My apartment isn't far. If you still want to go, we should head out now. Frank, would you like to join us? Frank nodded. Wild horses couldn't keep me away. 30 minutes later, the group stood in Wilson's modest one-bedroom apartment. The walls were adorned with military honors and photographs spanning decades. Wilson led them to a small study where a polished wooden chest sat in the corner. My memory isn't what it used to be, Wilson admitted as he knelt with difficulty before the chest. But I remember putting the letter in a blue archival box after Patricia and I sorted through everything. He opened the chest and began carefully removing items, medals, photographs, a worn journal, and finally, a blue acid-free document box. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted the lid. Inside, nestled among various papers, was an envelope identical to the one Elizabeth carried. The room fell silent as Wilson carefully removed it. The same faded handwriting. The same 1969 postmark. Even the slight coffee stain on the lower corner matched exactly. "That's impossible," Thomas whispered. Wilson handed the envelope to Elizabeth. "Open it." With trembling fingers, Elizabeth slid out the letter. The paper felt just as fragile, the handwriting just as familiar. She read the first few lines silently. "My dearest family. Tonight the jungle is alive with sounds, but somehow it feels quieter than usual." Word for word, it matched the letter she had received in her mailbox. "They're identical," she confirmed, her voice barely audible. Frank sat heavily in a nearby chair. "In all my years, I've never seen anything like this." Wilson carefully took the letter back from Elizabeth and returned it to its protective box. "There's someone else you should meet. Another man from our unit who might help make sense of this." "Who?" Jenny asked. "David Chen. He was the company medic and became a doctor after the war. More importantly, he and your father were close. They talked about things the rest of us weren't privy to." Wilson reached for his phone. "He lives across town. I know he's not at the reunion because he's recovering from hip surgery, but he might be up for a short visit." While Wilson made the call, Elizabeth stepped to a window, trying to gather her thoughts. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the city. How had a simple letter led them down this rabbit hole of impossibility? "He'll see us," Wilson announced after a brief conversation. "His daughter is with him, so we won't be imposing." The taxi ride to Dr. Chen's home was quiet, each person lost in their own thoughts. Elizabeth clutched her purse containing the letter that had started it all. Next to her, Jenny stared out the window, her expression unreadable. Dr. Chen lived in a handsome brownstone on a tree-lined street. His daughter, a woman in her 40s, greeted them warmly at the door. "Dad's in the sunroom," she said. "He's quite excited to meet you. It's been years since he's talked about Vietnam." The sunroom was bright and airy, filled with plants and comfortable furniture. Dr. Chen sat in a recliner, a blanket over his legs despite the warmth of the day. He was a small man with intelligent eyes that lit up when Wilson entered. "Jim Wilson," he said, his voice strong despite his frail appearance. "Still causing trouble, I see." Wilson smiled. "Some things never change." Introductions were made, and Dr. Chen studied Elizabeth and Jenny with interest. "You have your father's eyes," he told Elizabeth. "Both of you do." When they were all seated, Wilson explained the situation, showing Dr. Chen both letters. The elderly doctor listened without interruption, examining each envelope and letter carefully. "Your father was a remarkable man," he said finally, returning the letters. "We spent many nights on watch together, talking about life, philosophy, and the nature of reality." "Frank mentioned Dad had some kind of sixth sense," Jenny said hesitantly. Dr. Chen nodded. "That's one way to describe it. Your father believed strongly in what he called connections, the idea that people who loved each other shared bonds that transcended physical limitations." "Like some kind of telepathy?" Thomas asked skeptically. More than that, Dr. Chen replied. He believed that strong emotion, particularly love, could transcend time itself under certain circumstances. He smiled gently at their expressions. Remember, we were young men in an incomprehensible war, facing mortality daily. Such discussions were not unusual. Elizabeth thought about the letter she'd received, how it had arrived exactly 50 years after it was written, at a time when she was feeling particularly nostalgic about her father. The night before Hollow Valley, Dr. Chen continued, your father and I were on watch together. He told me he'd written letters to your family, but he was worried they wouldn't reach you. He paused, his gaze distant with memory. He said, if something happens to me tomorrow, I need to know they'll hear from me one more time. Not just words on paper, Chen, but something real. Something that carries what I feel for them. Elizabeth felt tears forming. And what did you tell him? I told him what my grandmother in Taiwan had taught me, that intention is powerful, and that a message sent with enough love and purpose will always find its way home, even if it takes lifetimes. Dr. Chen looked at both letters spread before him. I believe your father took that quite literally. You're suggesting he somehow, what? Created a duplicate letter that waited 50 years to appear? Thomas couldn't keep the disbelief from his voice. Dr. Chen shrugged. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm simply telling you what your father believed and what we now observe, two identical letters, one that traveled a conventional path and one that appeared 50 years later in exactly the right mailbox. But how is that possible? Jenny whispered. Perhaps, Dr. Chen said gently, that's not the question we should be asking. Perhaps instead we should ask, what message was so important that your father needed to ensure it reached you twice, once through Lieutenant Wilson's safekeeping, and once again, 50 years later, directly to you? Elizabeth thought about the timing of the letter's arrival, just as she had been contemplating selling the family farm, the home her father had written about preserving for future generations. He wanted us to know he was thinking of us, she said softly. That we were his last thoughts. And perhaps, Dr. Chen suggested, he wanted you to know that some connections never fade, even across time. The room fell silent as they all contemplated this possibility. Outside, the late afternoon sun painted the room in golden light, and somewhere in the distance, church bells began to ring. There's one more thing you should see, Dr. Chen said, breaking the silence. Something your father left with me for safekeeping. He gestured to his daughter, who went to a nearby bookshelf and removed a small wooden box. She handed it to her father, who opened it carefully and removed a small package wrapped in faded green cloth. He asked me to keep this until the time was right, Dr. Chen explained, holding the package out to Elizabeth. I believe that time has come. Elizabeth accepted the small package with trembling hands. The green cloth was military issue, faded by decades but still intact. She looked at Dr. Chen questioningly. Go ahead, he encouraged her. He wanted you to have this. Carefully, Elizabeth unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a small leather journal and a metal object that caught the sunlight streaming through the windows. She lifted it out, a worn compass, its brass case scratched and dented from use. He carried that compass through every mission, Dr. Chen explained. Said it always pointed him toward home, no matter where he was. Elizabeth opened the compass. The needle swung and then steadied, pointing north. Inside the lid was a tiny photograph, yellowed with age but still clear, her mother holding baby Jenny, with Elizabeth, age 6, standing proudly beside them. And the journal? Jenny asked, leaning closer. Elizabeth opened the leather-bound book. The pages were filled with her father's familiar handwriting, dated entries spanning his time in Vietnam. She turned to the final entry, dated the day before Hollow Valley. May 14, 1969 *. Tomorrow's mission feels different. The others sense it too, though no one says it out loud. I've told Wilson, Frank, and Rivera to adjust their positions during the advance. Can't explain how I know, just that I do. Chen understands better than the others. We talked about connections tonight, how love creates bridges that even time can't wash away, asterisk. If my hunches are right about tomorrow, I may not be writing another entry. So I'm leaving this with Chen, along with my compass. Someday, I hope Lizzie will read these pages and understand that even in this distant jungle, I was thinking of home, of Mary and our girls, asterisk. I had that dream again last night, the one where I'm standing in the farmhouse, but it's many years from now. Everything is different, yet somehow the same. In the dream, Lizzie is older, with gray in her hair like Mary's mother has. She's considering selling the farm. I try to tell her to hold on to it, that it's more important than she knows, but she can't hear me. Perhaps this journal will speak for me when the time comes, asterisk. The strangest part of the dream was seeing an older man with Lizzie who had my smile, my build. Could it be a grandson I'll never meet? The thought brings both joy and sorrow, asterisk. If Chen is right about intentions finding their way across time, then perhaps these words, this compass, and the letters I've written will reach my family when they need them most. Some things are meant to be preserved, our home, our legacy, our connections to each other. Until then, or beyond then, all my love. Elizabeth looked up from the journal, tears streaming down her face. He knew, she whispered. Somehow, he knew I was thinking about selling the farm. The developers made an offer last month. Jenny took her sister's hand. After all these years. Dr. Chen nodded solemnly. Your father had a deep connection to that land, to your family's heritage. He talked about it often, how his grandfather had built the farmhouse, how he hoped his children and grandchildren would walk those fields someday. Thomas, who had been reading over his mother's shoulder, looked stunned. He described me. A grandson he never met. Dr. Chen's daughter brought a tray with tea and water. As she served them, Wilson spoke up. I remember your father talking about that farm. Said his happiest memories were from there. The old lieutenant looked at Elizabeth earnestly. Is it still the same place he described? The big oak tree by the pond, the red barn with the white trim? Elizabeth nodded. Yes, though the barn needed repainting. Thomas did that last summer. She glanced at her son with a small smile. We were preparing it to sell. What will you do now? Frank asked. Elizabeth looked down at the compass in her hand, then at the journal with its final entry. Something settled in her chest, a certainty that hadn't been there before. I think I'll keep it in the family, she said. Dad went to extraordinary lengths to tell me it was important. I should listen. Jenny squeezed her sister's hand. I think that's the right decision. Dr. Chen smiled, a peace in his expression that seemed to transcend the moment. I believe I've fulfilled my promise to your father at last. For 50 years, I've kept these items safe, waiting for the right time to pass them on. But how did you know now was the right time? Thomas asked. I didn't, Dr. Chen replied simply. But when Jim called and said you had received a letter that shouldn't exist, I knew your father's intentions had finally found their way home. After thanking Dr. Chen and promising to stay in touch, the group made their way back outside. The evening was settling in, the city starting to light up against the darkening sky. What happens now? Jenny asked as they stood on the sidewalk. Wilson smiled. Now you go home, carrying a piece of your father with you. And tomorrow, our reunion continues. I hope you'll join us, there are many more men who would love to meet Robert's daughters. Elizabeth nodded. We'd like that very much. That night, back in their hotel room, Elizabeth sat by the window, reading through her father's journal by lamplight while Jenny and Thomas slept. Entry after entry revealed a young man struggling with the realities of war while clinging to memories of home. He wrote of missing his daughter's birthdays, of dreaming about teaching them to fish in the pond on their farm, of planning improvements to the property upon his return. One entry from early 1969 caught her attention. Chen and I talked about quantum physics tonight, of all things. He studied it briefly before medical school. He explained how particles that once interacted remain connected, regardless of distance. Changes to one instantaneously affect the other. Entanglement, he called it. I told him that's exactly how I feel about Mary and the girls, that no matter how far apart we are, we remain connected. He laughed and said maybe that's why my hunches about them are so accurate. I knew Lizzie had fallen from the apple tree 2 days before Mary's letter arrived confirming it. I wonder if such connections can span time as well as space. Sometimes I feel glimpses of a future I won't be part of, Lizzie all grown up, Jenny with children of her own. Not just imagination, but something more tangible. Chen says Eastern philosophies have long understood what Western science is only beginning to grasp, that time is not the straight line we perceive it to be. Elizabeth closed the journal, her father's voice echoing in her mind. She gazed out at the city lights, wondering about the nature of time and connection. Perhaps some bonds were indeed strong enough to reach across decades, carrying messages of love and purpose when they were needed most. The compass sat on the nightstand, its needle pointing steadily northward, toward home. Tomorrow they would meet more men who had known her father, hearing stories of his courage and character. Then they would return to the farm with a renewed sense of its importance, not just as property but as a physical anchor for the connections her father had valued so deeply. Elizabeth smiled, feeling closer to her father than she had in 50 years. Whatever mysterious forces had delivered his letter at precisely the moment she needed his guidance, she was profoundly grateful for their intervention. Message received, Dad, she whispered to the night. Message received. The second day of the reunion brought a flood of emotions as Elizabeth and Jenny met more veterans who had served alongside their father. Each man had a story, how Robert had shared his rations with homesick soldiers, calmed nerves before dangerous missions, or simply listened when others needed to talk. Your dad was the moral compass of our unit, one elderly veteran told them over coffee. When things got dark, and they did get dark, he reminded us why we were there and who we were at heart. Elizabeth recorded these stories on her phone, precious glimpses of the father she'd lost so young. Jenny, who had only the faintest memories of Robert, absorbed every word with quiet intensity. During a lull in the activities, Elizabeth found Lieutenant Wilson sitting alone, watching the proceedings with a thoughtful expression. May I join you? She asked. Wilson nodded, gesturing to the empty chair beside him. I was just thinking about your father. About that last day. Elizabeth settled beside him. I'd like to hear about it, if you're willing to share. Wilson was silent for a long moment, collecting his thoughts. Your father insisted on going to higher ground to call in our coordinates. The captain was down, communications were scrambled, and we were taking heavy fire. I ordered him to stay put, I outranked him, but he looked me in the eye and said, with respect, Lieutenant, you know I need to do this. Wilson's eyes grew distant with memory. He handed me that letter and said, make sure this gets to them, Jim. No matter how long it takes. Then he was gone, running through open terrain with the radio. Elizabeth could picture it, her father's determination, his focus on the mission and the men around him. He made it to the ridgeline, Wilson continued. Got the transmission out, clear and precise. I could hear his voice on the command channel, directing the air support to our exact location. The enemy knew what he was doing, concentrated their fire on his position. Wilson paused, swallowing hard. He stayed on that radio until the choppers were overhead. His last words on the channel were, tell my girls I'll always find a way home. Elizabeth felt tears slide down her cheeks. And now he has. Wilson nodded. Somehow, he has. That evening, as the reunion dinner came to a close, the veterans honored Robert with a moment of silence. Elizabeth and Jenny stood beside a display of photographs, including one of their father that Wilson had contributed, a young man in uniform, smiling confidently at the camera, unaware of what lay ahead. "Tomorrow we head home," Jenny said softly as they prepared to leave. Wilson approached them, leaning on his cane. "Before you go, there's something I'd like to give you." He handed Elizabeth a small box. "I had this made yesterday. Hope you don't mind." Inside was a shadow box frame containing Robert's service medals, which Wilson had kept all these years. "These belong with his family," the old lieutenant said simply. Elizabeth embraced him, this man who had carried her father's final words for half a century. "Thank you for keeping your promise to him." Wilson's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Your father saved my life twice, once in that valley, and once after I came home, when the memories threatened to drown me. Remembering his courage gave me strength on my darkest days. I'm the one who should be thanking you." The journey home the following day was quiet, each of them lost in thought. Thomas drove while Elizabeth and Jenny pored over their father's journal in the back seat, reading entries aloud to each other, laughing and crying by turns. As they crossed into familiar countryside, Elizabeth felt a growing sense of homecoming. The weathered sign welcoming them to their small town, the familiar storefronts lining Main Street, and finally, the turnoff to the farm, all seemed more precious now, imbued with deeper meaning. The farmhouse stood as it had for generations, solid and welcoming against the afternoon sky. Elizabeth stepped out of the car and took a deep breath of country air. The compass in her pocket seemed to warm slightly, as if responding to their arrival. "Home," she said simply. The next morning, Elizabeth woke early. Leaving Jenny and Thomas still sleeping, she took her father's compass and journal and walked the property as the sun rose. The old oak tree, the pond, the field stretching toward the horizon, all appeared in her father's writings, described with love and longing. She settled on a bench near the pond, opening the journal to read in the clear morning light. As she turned the pages, a folded piece of paper slipped out, one she hadn't noticed before. It was different from the journal pages, crisper and less yellowed. Unfolding it carefully, Elizabeth discovered a hand-drawn map of the farm. Various spots were marked with small X's and notes in her father's handwriting. One near the old oak was circled repeatedly, with the notation, "For my grandsons, plant yourself deeper." Elizabeth stared at the map in confusion. How could her father have known about grandsons he would never meet? Thomas was her only child, and Jenny had daughters, no sons. She walked to the oak tree, studying the ground around it. Nothing seemed unusual. She looked back at the map, then at the tree, puzzling over her father's cryptic message. "Mom?" Thomas called, walking toward her from the house. "Everything okay?" "Dad left a map," she explained, showing him the paper. "With a message about grandsons." Thomas studied it with interest. "Weird. Maybe it's symbolic?" As they stood beneath the oak's spreading branches, a sudden gust of wind swept through, rustling the leaves and sending something small and dark tumbling from above. It landed with a soft thud between them. Elizabeth bent down and picked up an acorn, perfectly formed and heavy with possibility. "Plant yourself deeper," she repeated her father's words, understanding dawning. He wasn't just talking about keeping the farm. He wanted us to put down roots here, to grow the family tree. Thomas looked from the acorn to the magnificent oak above them. Like this tree his grandfather might have planted. Elizabeth nodded, feeling a connection across generations, from Robert's grandfather who had first claimed this land, to her father who had cherished it even from a distant jungle, to Thomas who had restored the barn, and now to future generations yet unborn. "We should plant it," she said, holding up the acorn. "Start a new tree for the future." Thomas smiled. "Dad and I were talking about starting a family soon. If we have a son, we could name him Robert." Elizabeth felt a warmth spread through her chest. "Your father would love that." Later that day, as Thomas prepared to head back to his own home in town, Elizabeth handed him the compass. "I want you to have this," she said. "To help you find your way home, just like it did for Dad." Thomas accepted it reverently. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely. That's what your grandfather would want." She smiled. "Besides, I think I'll be staying put for a while. Jenny's talking about moving back too, says her city apartment feels empty after seeing the farm again." As Thomas drove away, Elizabeth stood on the porch, watching the dust settle on the long driveway. She held her father's journal against her heart, feeling a sense of rightness, of things coming full circle. The mystery of the letter might never be fully explained. Perhaps it was quantum entanglement, as her father and Dr. Chen had discussed. Perhaps it was something science couldn't yet comprehend, the power of a father's love reaching across decades to guide his daughter when she needed him most. Whatever the explanation, the message had been received, and the connection restored. Like the acorn they had planted that morning, Robert's legacy would continue to grow, taking root in the very soil he had fought to protect. Elizabeth looked out over the fields glowing in the late afternoon sun. "I won't sell," she whispered. "I promise." And somewhere, she felt certain, her father heard. 1 year later, the farmhouse buzzed with activity. Jenny had made good on her plan to move back, renovating the old guest cottage at the edge of the property. Elizabeth had converted part of the barn into a small museum dedicated to local veterans, inspired by her father's story. Robert's medals, journal, and photographs formed the centerpiece of the display. The mysterious duplicate letters, one that had traveled the conventional path through Lieutenant Wilson's care, and one that had appeared as if by magic in Elizabeth's mailbox, were displayed side by side in a custom frame, protected by UV-resistant glass. Visitors often stood before them in quiet contemplation, pondering the inexplicable. On a warm Saturday in April, exactly 1 year after the letter's arrival, Elizabeth hosted a special gathering. Lieutenant Wilson had made the journey despite his declining health, accompanied by his daughter Patricia. Dr. Chen had come too, moving carefully with his walker but his eyes still bright with intelligence. Several other veterans from Robert's unit had traveled from across the country for the occasion. "I never imagined we'd be here," Wilson said as Elizabeth walked with him around the property. "When I couldn't deliver that letter to your mother all those years ago, I thought I'd failed your father." "You didn't fail," Elizabeth assured him. "Everything happened exactly when it needed to. Dad would say it couldn't have unfolded any other way." They paused by the small sapling growing near the massive oak tree, the acorn they had planted months ago already reaching skyward with tender determination. "Thomas called this morning," Elizabeth said, smiling. "The baby is due in September. The doctor says it's a boy." Wilson's weathered face creased with joy. Robert would be so proud. Inside the farmhouse, Jenny was showing Dr. Chen a series of paintings she'd created, inspired by entries from their father's journal. Her artistic career had taken a new direction since reconnecting with her father's legacy, focusing on themes of memory, time, and connection. "These capture something essential," Dr. Chen observed, studying a painting that depicted jungle foliage morphing into the farm's familiar landscape. "The way different times and places exist simultaneously in our hearts." Jenny nodded. "That's exactly what I was trying to express. Reading Dad's journal, I realized he never really left this farm, even when he was physically in Vietnam. And somehow, he never really left us, either." The afternoon sun was beginning to lower in the sky when Elizabeth gathered everyone on the wide front porch. Farm tables had been arranged in a long row, decorated with wildflowers from the fields. Local families whose relatives were honored in the Veterans Museum joined them, creating a community bound by shared history. Elizabeth stood at the head of the table, looking out at the faces turned toward her, old and young, connected by invisible threads of memory and purpose. "A year ago, a letter arrived that changed everything," she began. "It came 50 years after it was written, carrying my father's voice across time. That letter led us to discover not just who my father was, but who we are because of him. She raised a glass. Today we honor not just my father, Robert Johnson, but all those who served alongside him, those who returned home and those who didn't. We honor the connections that sustain us across time and distance, and the love that finds a way to reach us, no matter how impossible it seems. The gathering raised their glasses in response. As they did, a gentle breeze swept across the porch, rustling the papers on the memorial table where Robert's photographs were displayed. One photo, the image of him in uniform, smiling confidently, toppled over. Elizabeth stepped forward to write it, but paused when she noticed something on the back she'd never seen before. Faded pencil marks formed words in her father's handwriting. "I'll find my way home. April 2019. She stared at the date, the exact month and year when the letter had mysteriously appeared in her mailbox. The photo had been in Wilson's possession all these decades, yet somehow her father had written a date 50 years in the future. Without drawing attention to her discovery, Elizabeth carefully returned the photo to its place. Some mysteries were meant to be pondered in private. As twilight softened the landscape, lanterns were lit along the porch and music began to play, songs from the 1960s that her father might have known. The veterans shared stories, some somber, others bringing unexpected laughter. Children played on the lawn, oblivious to the weight of history swirling around them yet inheritors of its legacy. Elizabeth found herself standing at the edge of the property, looking out over the fields her family had tended for generations. Dr. Chen joined her, moving slowly but deliberately to her side. "You found something today," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. Elizabeth hesitated, then nodded. "Another impossible thing. A message from Dad with the date the letter would arrive, written 50 years before it happened." Dr. Chen didn't seem surprised. "Your father understood something most people never grasp, that time is not the straight line we perceive. Perhaps in some moment of clarity, standing guard in that jungle, thinking of home, he glimpsed across the decades." "Do you really believe that's possible?" Elizabeth asked. The elderly doctor smiled. "I've lived long enough to know that the universe is far more mysterious than we can comprehend. What matters is not how your father's messages found their way to you, but that they did, and that you were open to receiving them." They stood in companionable silence, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. "Will you tell the others what you found?" Dr. Chen asked eventually. Elizabeth considered this. "No, I don't think so. Some things are like Dad's letter, they arrive exactly when they're meant to, not before." Later that night, after the guests had departed and the farmhouse was quiet once more, Elizabeth sat on the porch swing, her father's journal open in her lap. The entry she had turned to was one she had read many times over the past year. "Mary asked in her last letter if I'm afraid out here. The truth is, sometimes I am. Not of dying, exactly, but of being forgotten. Of the girls growing up without knowing who their father was or how much he loved them. I told Chen about this fear tonight, and he said something that brought me comfort: those we love with our whole hearts are never truly separated from us. Time and distance are illusions. In the moments that matter most, you will be there for them, and they will know." Elizabeth closed the journal gently. In the distance, an owl called, its voice carrying clearly through the night air. The same species, perhaps, that her father had heard in that distant jungle as he wrote his final letter home. She thought about the sapling growing beside the ancient oak, about Thomas's son who would be named Robert, about the museum that would preserve not just her father's memory but the stories of all those who had served. Links in a chain stretching backward and forward through time, connecting generations. Her father had found his way home, just as he promised. Not in the way anyone could have expected or explained, but in the only way that truly mattered, through love that refused to be limited by the boundaries of time or space or even death itself. Elizabeth looked up at the star-filled sky and whispered, "Thank you for the letter, Dad. I got the message. We all did. And in that moment, as farm sounds mingled with night breezes, she felt certain that somewhere beyond ordinary understanding, her father heard her words and was at peace.